Hello everyone, welcome to DeHavilland's latest event. My name is Arran Russell, I'm the Head of Content and Service here at DeHavilland. Today we are talking about levelling up and specifically the white paper published yesterday. Thank you for joining us. With me today are Katie Frank, Francesca Fraser and Sophie Timms. Katie is the Associate Director of the Northern Research Group, the group of Conservative MPs representing areas in the north of England, Wales and the Scottish borders, aimed at getting greater investment for those areas, so very, very topical. Before that, Katie has worked for a number of MPs, MSPs, MEPs, as well as public affairs roles in-house and in agency. Welcome, Katie. Francesca is a senior researcher at the think tank Onward, which has really been pumping out a number of reports around levelling up, including the last couple of years, a couple actually with Neil O'Brien, who's obviously the minister in the department. Francesca has been at Onward for the last couple of years, and before that she worked at the Electoral Commission and a short stint at Policy Exchange as well. Thank you for joining us, Francesca. And finally, Sophie Timms. Sophie is Corporate Affairs Director at Kier Group. Before Kier, Sophie was at Zurich for around 20 years, where she had many public affairs and corporate affairs roles, including Head of Corporate Affairs. So it's great to get your perspective on all this, Sophie. Thanks very much for joining us. This is the first event we've done, which is meant as a sort of a debrief, a quite reactive event to a recent announcement. So we are really grateful to our panelists for agreeing to do this at such short notice, and thank you all for joining us. For those watching, if you have questions, please do share them on the chat. They'll come through and they'll work their way through to me. If you want to aim them at a specific person, then please do so. Right, that's definitely enough from me. I'm going to hand over to our fantastic panelists. We're going to give their take on the white paper, all from slightly different angles. So, Francesca, if you can kick us off with your overview of the white paper and the main takeaways, please.
Morning. Thanks, Arran, and thanks for inviting me to speak. I've been asked to give a very brief overview of the white paper and to pull out some of the key things. I apologise in advance if I don't cover them all. It's a very, very long document, and despite my best efforts, I almost certainly will not cover everything. But the main thing I'd like to say, I think the white paper represents a really positive step forward. Previous governments for a number of decades have tried and failed to address this real decline in jobs and civic pride and opportunities, and also close this productivity gap that we see where the London and the South East are much more productive than other places. And it goes right back to the cause, I think, of why we have some of these regional imbalances. And it tries to set out a really practical route map with a bunch of sort of accountability measures attached to how we do this and how we regenerate opportunity across the UK. And to do this, the paper starts with considering why these gaps have been able to grow as they have. And they point to a range of factors that contribute to productivity being much higher in places like London and the South East. And crucially, they look at a reason of factors, and they're not the obvious ones you might think of. And I think this is one of the reasons why in the past levelling up has sort of been accused of being everything and nothing. But I think it's right to take this sort of holistic approach because ultimately all these factors are really important. So things like financial capital, things like physical infrastructure, our roads and our trains, things like social capital, where people are able to meet in their communities, and civic pride and believing that they can sort of accomplish all they can in their communities and really be a force for change in their own place because they're ultimately the people that know best. And the way the white paper is framed is they set sort of 12 missions, most of them the clear date that at sort of 2030 they hope to reach them. And I think this is important because it gives some clarity and accountability. And these missions include things like closing the gap in income and employment and productivity between the lowest and poorest performing regions, to try and bring the average up in those poorer places rather than bring the higher places down. There's some measures on sort of education, ensuring 90% of primary school children reach the expected standard for numeracy and literacy. And then giving every part of England that wants it a devolution deal, which is a really, really central part in this, by 2030. And then there's some other things that are sort of more holistic, like improving life expectancy and well-being and sort of things like this. And I think the important thing with what these missions are trying to do, and they've been enshrined in law, which is a really crucial part, particularly given some of the sort of political instability that we're all seeing at the moment, having that legal commitment to do some of these things and to publish the spatial effect will be really, really crucial in making sure that this is something that is a long-term project. There's been sort of criticism that 2030 is too far away, and there's also criticism that it's probably not enough time. And so I think putting it in law and doing it this way is a really important way of showing that this isn't just going to be a short-term project up until the next election. If it's going to work, it needs to be long-term. It needs to be accompanied by sustainable sort of funding and networks, and giving people the power to do these things themselves. And I was just going to pull out 3 key things that really excite me in it. So the first one is R&D funding and the new innovation accelerators. In the past, Onward research has shown that as much as 50% of public R&D funding has gone to London and South East. And this has led to 72% of the jobs in these sort of knowledge intensive sectors that typically are higher paying, higher sort of occupations, the SOC codes 1 to 3. If you know what those are, slightly sort of wonky language. So 2/3 of these jobs have ended up in London, Oxford or Cambridge. And that's a huge difference considering these places roughly account for about 20% of the population, these sort of small areas around them. And so the commitment to boost funding for R&D by 40% minimum by 2030 is really, really important because it shows a clear recognition of how R&D policy has been too concentrated. And it also plays an important role in sort of sucking in private R&D. The weird thing that we've seen in the past is that actually public R&D is much more concentrated than private R&D. You've got businesses who recognise the value of investing. In the North and the Midlands, we've seen things like Nissan and Sunderland. They recognise the opportunities that come from spending money outside of the Golden Triangle in the way that on paper, public funding hasn't. Because of the incentives and the way these things all work. And we can go into a bit of that in the future, later on if you'd like to. The next thing I'd like to point out is education skills, which is something that's particularly close to my heart. The education investment areas are a really, really sensible thing to do. There's sort of 55 areas of places that have a deficit of good schools and really, really constructive methods to try and improve the outcomes in these places. For example, steps to re-broke up underperforming schools, so those that have been consistently marked as bad by Ofsted, into multi-academy trusts that have a proven method of turning these things around. A new national academy, which is a sort of digital national approach to providing a sort of top-up digital support for schools, and then a wider focus on digital skills for adult populations and helping people that are in work skill up at the same time. And lastly, the thing I'd like to look at is steps to empower communities. This is something that Onward has done a lot of work in the past. Sometimes there's a sort of slightly odd attitude that these sort of community level approaches don't really have an effect on productivity and economic growth, but that's just simply not true. It's so important to have this basis of a strong community, feeling of belonging, and these things really, really feed into economic productivity and all these things we're talking about. So the new programs for 20 local areas, identifying strong leadership to try and bring in some of these interventions, really important. And then giving them roles to help turn around brownfield sites and fill vacant buildings and fix sort of renters' rights in those areas. A new landlord for register for landlords. All these things are really positive steps to try and help the people in those areas be put on the best stead forward to try and respond to these problems. So that's just 3 things. There's a whole range of more things in there. For example, football pitches, abolishing the 80-20 rule for housing, which is a really positive step. But we can go into more of those. But those are just some of the key things that I think put it on a really important step to try and redirect some of these incentives that for too long have skewed towards London and South East, and have meant that there's plenty of talent across the UK and it's not being recognised. So yeah, I think it's really positive and I look forward to the discussion.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for that, Francesca. That a really good way for us to kick off the session. I know we gave you a bit of a hospital pass there with the summarising the 130 odd, but I think you did a great job there. Thank you very much. And thank you also for people sending in questions already as well. Thanks, that's much appreciated. Do keep them coming. So next, over to you, Katie. I think it's quite obvious that obviously the organisation you represent are quite an important player in this. I know you can't speak for all of the MPs, don't worry, we understand that, but I think it'd be really great to get your take next, please.
Yeah, thanks, Arran, and a great summary by Francesca, who certainly had her work cut out with the document. Luckily, it wasn't as long as the original draft, which I believe was 400 pages, but they managed to get it down to 300 and something. There are lovely briefing notes going about, which I'm sure DeHavilland have their own insights into. So even though we're sort of here at short notice, we're finally here is the important thing to say. This has been something that we've been waiting a long time for. The Northern Research Group has been heavily engaged with the white paper, both with Michael Gove, Andy Haldane, and also the civil servants and special advisors that sit around that and other organisations that have also fed into this process. So what does levelling up really mean? So as Francesca and Arran have sort of alluded to, it was a very broad, holistic approach, but I think fundamentally for some of you political wonks out there, it is maybe summarised best by the phrase, are you better off now than you were 5 years ago? And it's that sort of mentality, and it's everything that encompasses that. And fundamentally, from a Northern perspective, what people want are good jobs, their kids to be able to go to decent schools, and that their children don't have to move out of the area to find good jobs and to get well-paying jobs and to find decent housing and things like that and opportunities. And I think that the UK is too centralised in that sort of way. And I know that there have been references to the South Korean model, stuff that happens in America as well. So I was asked the political thoughts going on at the moment. So in terms of the Northern Research Group, their view on the white paper, so we were given a briefing and we'd fed into this process multiple times, so we already knew what was coming. White papers, I don't know how many of you have worked with them before. They're generally a framework rather than the actual meat on the bones sort of thing. So these are sort of your KPIs almost, your intentions. So it's great how it's going to be made in law as well. We're going to have likely a bill in the Queen's speech to be announced as well, and that's something we've been told at the very least. So in terms of framework and the aims, it's great. One thing I know some people would be concerned about is it perhaps sounds a bit too much like net zero targets, and what we don't want to do is put the horse before the cart, so to speak. So they're very happy in terms of that. They view it as a down payment. This is the first sort of thing that we need to do, but as Jake Berry, who's the chairman, has rightly set out, Theresa May didn't need white papers to get on with things, and neither did David Cameron. You don't need white papers in order to get on and do the job. And some of this is, obviously you've got things about education, which is great, and transport, which is great. However, one of the things the government recognise is that they want to also attract foreign direct investment into this, which is why I think that the rather ill-judged comments by Steve Baker weren't actually accurate to what is in the content of the white paper. Him calling it a nanny state approach. Well, I don't think that's the case. And I think the Treasury would like a healthy amount of receipts from FDI. And one of the things in the sort of devolution, so to speak, is that places are going to be able to market themselves as well to attract that. Ben Houchin, for instance, has done a sterling job, even with my non-political hat on, Andy Burnham, not too bad. And the issue is the mayoral system and the devolution system that we've got at the moment in England specifically is geared towards city mayors, and we have fantastic counties in this country which, you know, offer a wide variety of things, whether it's, you know, leisure and tourism, or whether it's some of your manufacturing sectors which aren't in fact based in cities. Usually they're not. So it's great that that's been recognised in terms of that, and also that there are, you know, you've got the state involvement and the business side of things. The one thing the Northern Research Group would like to see going forward, and that they've made very clear to government, is that we need a stronger Northern voice. And I think the Conservative Party has been very bad at selling itself anyway. It's just one of the, I think, one of the natures of the Conservative Party. And you see this in terms of holding Nicola Sturgeon to account in Scotland, but also from a Conservative perspective, and certainly from a Northern Conservative perspective, Andy Burnham has been sort of seen as this voice for the North, and that's not the case. You know, not all Northerners agree with Andy Burnham, which I think is very apparent by our previous general election results. So I think that we need that counterbalance, and also someone sticking up for the North in cabinet more than Neil O'Brien potentially has done, even though he's from the same place that I am originally, the great town of Huddersfield, just to give it a little bit of a plug there. So I think in terms of, you know, you've obviously had the response from the NRG. They're very happy with it. They want government to get on with the job. They don't want them to wait for, you know, bills and any further progress through Parliament. They want, you know, shovels in the ground now, so to speak, and how we attract businesses to those areas, and basically to get the government to get out of the way and let people get on with it. In terms of Labour's response to the white paper, I think they'd written their speech probably a few weeks ago before they'd even read anything, probably before even some of the final pages were written in the white paper. So I wouldn't look at their response too deeply. So that's sort of the political feeling in Parliament at the moment. I think, unfortunately, it's been overshadowed by the current news cycle and some of those events there. But hopefully, with Michael Gove sort of overseeing the change through all of the departments, and this new board that they're wanting to set up, unfortunately led from Oxford, which I found a bit perplexing, but there we go, and we're talking about R&D outside of the Golden Triangle. But yeah, I think it's a very positive first step, and the NRG will be continuing to work with government. Michael Gove has made that his intention, and I think that the fact that the government recognised the NRG's input shows that local people are best to speak about their local areas, and that's, you know, one of the things behind this paper. And I think it's a positive first step, but I think we need to get on with the day job and do it, and not wait until 2 general election cycles later.
That's great. Thanks very much, Katie. Really interesting. I'm sure, again, lots in there that we'll come back to. Sophie, over to you to give us, please, a little bit of a business/industry perspective on the white paper, please.
Yeah, thanks, Arran, and thank you, Katie and Francesca. That was really interesting to see your perspectives, and it's good to be able to do the business perspective. So I don't know how familiar people are with Kier, but Kier's a construction and infrastructure company with a big focus on the public sector. So we build roads, rail, we look after utilities networks and some of the social infrastructure of the UK, so schools, hospitals, prisons, and most of those are delivered through national and local frameworks. So we're very interested in what the white paper had to say. We also have a property investment arm that works on regeneration schemes across towns and cities. So it feels like the white paper is dealing with a lot of the stuff that we're already doing, and it actually follows on from the National Infrastructure Strategy, which came out in November 2020, as well as, you know, the money that's been promised in previous budgets. So although it was light on new money, it does feel like the next step of that journey that sees infrastructure as a critical path, really, to helping us rebuild post-pandemic. In terms of projects coming onto the, you know, actually spades going into the ground. We did have a bit of a lag last year with those projects materialising, but I'd say that the market really does feel a little bit more lively suddenly, and we're particularly beginning to see opportunities arising in the northeast, in the northwest, the Midlands, and actually the southwest is pretty buoyant for Kier, and an area which I think has been a bit overlooked actually during levelling up discussions previously, which didn't chime at all with our experience, because as I say, we're working on a number of projects across the southwest that are really adding a boost in terms of facilities, jobs, skills, and in geographies that needed some help and were flagging a bit. So what I did enjoy in the white paper was a bit of that change of emphasis, that it isn't necessarily all about red wall votes and shoring those up, but that it actually tries to spread the love a bit more widely, really. In terms of its overall vision, I think it was designed to orientate the country to work a bit more collectively to restore levels of prosperity, pride, and that sort of greatness that we sort of romanticize about from our industrial past. What I would say though is probably that it was a paper that should have come out in early 2020 rather than this stage of the political game where it's a bit of a mess, frankly. And already it's been pushed off the front pages by energy cap conversations today, interest rates and so on. But there we are. As an optimist, I think though the UK does really have some unique and great strengths, and I think we're all ready for a mood of revival. And we're seeing that in construction. We've got a huge number of job vacancies and retraining and upskilling opportunities opening up across the UK and in new fields. So people probably have a perspective and a perception of what jobs in the construction industry look like, but we're looking at things like we need people like fibre optic technicians, people who are good at design and digital, people who have got skills in the net zero space. So that gives me cause for optimism, and a recruitment drive we launched last week is to actually do that, to get on board around 1,200 new people to deliver some of those projects that I talked about before. So I think there's cause for optimism. I suppose the big question mark though now is how good are we as a country at embracing devolution? I work every day trying to understand and engage with central, regional, local government, and it's complex and it's very, very political. The white paper was deliberate in its longer term approach, so that should try and span some electoral cycles and commit future governments to picking up the baton. But let's face it, real progress to get those three bits of the government pie to work together is going to take a bit of a mindset shift. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, particularly during the coming weeks and months, and what happens in the local elections in May. If things aren't overshadowed by current events in Westminster, inquiries, parties, leadership challenges, possible war in Europe. I mean, literally everything's going on that could distract us from delivering on this agenda. So I hope that's not the case. I guess to summarise, do I think the white paper presents opportunities for the construction sector? Yeah, absolutely. And we very much hope that this is the start of another infrastructure revolution. I think it does lead to prosperity. It will help different parts of the UK. And as a company like Kier, with a big focus in the public sector, we see our role very much as needing to co-create with local authorities and regional authorities around innovating, bringing net zero to life, making sure that there are skills opportunities out there. But it will require, some collective effort. So do I think devolution, cross-party political agreement, and the collective spirit to deliver this across the country will go smoothly? We'll see.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Sophie. That's really great introductions from all panelists. Thank you very much for that. And I'm gonna kick off with a couple of questions. That's okay. And then we've got plenty coming in, so we can move to those pretty quickly. Just on the devolution piece, obviously, because Sophie, you've really touched on that there quite a bit. There is obviously, as you said, this is going to add additional layers of complexity. It isn't going to be easy. It's quite light on detail in the white paper. I think you're right though, Kitty. This is it is a framework, but there seems to be an instinctive issue with this government, is they're not around devolution. I think particularly from the Prime Minister seems to have some issues with kind of devolution that's happened in the past, and even with what's going on in Greater Manchester. Sophie, could you maybe elaborate a little bit on that, and particularly from your perspective, on the devolution piece and the issues that you can foresee a little bit more, and perhaps some of the issues that you face already?
Yeah, I mean, actually, if you take the sort of position Lisa and Andy took, it's a bit of a contrast to the position the Metro mayors have taken, actually. So they've actually welcomed it probably more than I expected them to. And it provides them a real opportunity. And actually, we should be optimistic about what that looks like in terms of people trying to cooperate. I guess if I look at my day-to-day job and navigating local government, central government, and the tension between those two areas particularly, it is challenging. It is really challenging. And then we haven't even started talking about the devolved nations as well, because clearly, it wasn't really a factor in the white paper. So there are so many different vested interests here who all need to make a landing. And as I said in my remarks, that requires cross-party effort and cross-regional effort. So I don't know how it will play out. All I know is that there's often many agendas at play, and how to navigate that. I think the one thing I would say is that if anyone's adept at steering that course, it's Michael Gove. So that gives me some cause for hope.
Great, thanks. And Francesca, I think it'd be great to understand a little bit what Onward have been doing around the devolution piece, and maybe if you can as well, something that Sophie said, which I think was a really good point, just around the fact that this isn't just about the north. There are other bits that levelling up is definitely got to touch on, including even on some coastal towns in the southeast. I know you guys, perhaps I think you've done some work around this area.
Yeah, so I think there's fair points there. There are definitely probably fair criticisms that a lot of this is spoken exclusively about the north, and there's a huge amount of inequality and deprivation outside of it. And like you said, we've done some work highlighting this in the southwest. By way of devolution, I think this can be the answer to lots of it. The white paper is not the final answer, it's the start of it. My understanding is that some of the sort of county deals extend to places like Plymouth and Devon, so that kind of responds to that. But it's a start, and that's the main thing. And we need to work out how that works best. And there is a sort of cross-party question, but I think the white paper is quite honest about that. They're starting trailblazer looks at using the West Midlands, so Andy Street and Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, on how we can best do this. Because there's plenty of things that there's a very strong case to devolve. And we're starting to see that sort of infrastructure, adult skills, these things that local voices on the ground are much, much better off answering these questions than in Whitehall. They know what the demands are, they know what the people want, they know what they need just because they're closer to it. From an Onward point of view, we would support all of that, but I think there's also a case to go further and go much more local. There's things like parish councils and town councils that you don't hear that much about because they're sort of quite small and niche, and some people know about some people don't, but they're a really important way of giving a voice to local areas, and responding to these really small challenges that understandably people sitting in Whitehall probably aren't aware of, but matter to people. like parks and, you know, a reasonable playground for their children and the quality of roads, these sort of things, it's much easier to get a response on the ground from smaller hyper-local governance. And the white paper, whilst it doesn't necessarily go into as much detail, it does start these frameworks. They start looking at community deals, giving communities better say over how their community is run and how buildings in their local area can be repurposed. Things like encouraging vacant buildings to be repurposed for sort of community assets, shops, all these sort of things. So I think it's a step in the right direction. I understand the criticisms that maybe it's too much of a sort of focus on the north, but I think if it works, we can extend it. And that's the value of starting these trailblazer groups and all these things. Because they're not going to have all the answers immediately. It's about setting the frameworks and giving these places the opportunity to sort of determine their own fate, and then giving the powers that they want when they have it. I don't think it would work going the other way around and throwing powers at places that they aren't necessarily ready to work with yet. It's about building up those strong institutions to then try and change the fate. And the hope is that that's a sort of circular effect, because stronger institutions mean they're better at placing bids, they're better at boosting opportunities and productivity, and then they end up with a better framework to work with. So I think it's the start of it. I don't think they have all the answers, but I'm broadly pretty optimistic.
Super, thanks. And Katie, just for yourself on the devolution piece, I guess one thing, as you can tell, I'm sort of from the north. I this idea that everywhere in the north wants to be like the northern powerhouse, or dare I say, like London. I think I'm personally a little bit skeptical of that in terms of the
It's not that people want to be like London. I think that there would be severe, I mean, it even makes me recoil. I can feel the flat cap descending on my head right now. But no, it's not about being like London. And in our discussions with Andy Haldane, he, you know, was very clear. It's not about making Leeds or Manchester another London. That's not the case. What the intention is to bring our great cities, towns, etc., in line with their top international competitors, which is important because you know, it's if you look, for instance, at some of the South Korean models, now I'm always hesitant about referring to other countries because they have fundamentally different ways of operating in every aspect. But if you look at how they transferred things out of Seoul, their main city, in fact, I had the pleasure of going to one of those other cities they'd chosen, which is Daejeon, a great city, had, you know, everything, you know, you could want. And I think that's actually equalised prosperity around the country. Now, obviously, you know, we've had a lot of talk about moving the civil service out of London, to their great disdain, I may add, which, you know, is quite surprising. I don't know if they realise, but, you know, not everyone in the north or the southeast, southwest are, you know, these people that, you know, don't know how to, you know, potentially, you know, run the country. I think it's quite, you know, quite horrible that they think that. But so, and obviously that everyone just focuses on the state side of things, but that's not necessarily the case. It's about local areas being able to attract things. For instance, I was having a discussion the other day with some, I won't say where, but some foreign investment that wanted to come into the northwest to create a health tech super cluster. Now that's not a bad thing, and those are really great jobs, and we've got some great universities around there in terms of health. You know, Manchester, my former University of Liverpool, and I think that we do ourselves a disservice by saying that we're trying to compete with London. Absolutely not. And there are certain great things about having a capital city like London. I personally live in London, so I know the great things about it. But also, it's about easing the pressures on those cities, on the commuter belt as well, and without wanting to quote Thatcher and do, you know, the famous finger pointing, it's not about trying to drag down the rest of the country. It's not a zero-sum game, and it doesn't have to be. And that's not what the Northern Research Group thinks. In fact, a lot of the policies we've been promoting, we recognise can be spread across the country. And just to touch on a point that I know has been mentioned, just given my experience in Scotland, the reason the government didn't touch too much on devolution across the other nations is because they're reticent and almost can't without discussing it too much with the administrations. Now, the administrations, if they want to set out their own forms of levelling up and devolution and whatnot, that is absolutely their prerogative. And they certainly have the skill set should they wish to do so. However, my experience in Scotland, ironically, says that the devolved nations don't actually want to devolve that locally. In fact, if you just look at, in terms of Scotland and the way they've reorganised Police Scotland, bringing it more central and the problems that's caused. So I think hopefully maybe we could encourage Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland to devolve to their communities too, because they have a diverse array of wonderful places too, cities, towns, you name it, they've got it as well. And I think that including in those places, yes, more local is better, and more local doesn't necessarily mean more layers of government. We can actually pull these and streamline them. I mean, we don't want to end up like Belgium with about 20 different layers of government. I think that would cause everyone a headache. But yeah, that's just sort of my thoughts on the devolution aspect.
Thanks for that. I mean, yeah, I think it's certainly a concern coming from business, though, isn't it, about potential complexity that could be an issue there. I think we'll move on. We've got a fair few questions, and I had one myself as well, just around the money, because I think it is a fair point that some of these missions and the targets themselves by 2030 feel like they're going to need quite a bit of additional money, and obviously at the moment that doesn't seem to be there. Someone here is asking about just about Rishi Sunak. He seems to be unconvinced, giving more freedoms and resources to local government. Someone else here talking about the IFS, that there's a risk that there's the government has chosen its destination, but with no sense of how to get there. There does seem to be a gap with the ambition and the amount of funding. Francesca, I know you've kind of spoken about this, but do you want to maybe talk a little bit more about any issues you see there in terms of the lack of the funds?
Yeah, so I totally understand this line of argument. To do this is going to take a lot of money. But we knew it was the levelling up white paper wasn't going to include huge sums of money. The spending review set out their departmental budgets, and it was quite clear that there wasn't going to be as much money to this as some people wanted. It does allocate some money. For example, R&D spending outside of London South East is going to increase by 40% by 2030. 2030. And sort of 12 billion on affordable housing. So there is some pots of money, but I think the main thing to recognise is that this isn't just about sort of pots of cash. One of the main reasons why we face this difficulty is because the incentives and the institutions that we have in the UK have, over a long period of time, encouraged funding to go to already prosperous places. We've seen this with sort of growth enhancing spending. Cultural funding is massively skewed to London. We see things like R&D. Like I said, London actually has a sort of London weighting, which means that they naturally get more money than other regions. We've seen this with affordable housing. The way affordable housing funding works means that it goes on where there's the greatest need for housing. Naturally, London has more people in it, and so the need there is greatest, and that's why they end up with more housing. There's things that we can change institutionally that are long term, that go much more beyond individual like settlements of money. So I think that's the main thing that we need to focus here, which is just retargeting all these investments and building up the institutions in other parts that can attract funding. We've seen great examples of Andy Street, Ben Houch, and Andy Burnham, who are really effective in attracting funding to their regions because they're such a strong voice. We've seen this with other countries, have it with sort of FDI, where mayors are a brilliant asset to try and tell businesses what the benefits are of investing in that local area. So I don't think all the money needs to come from central government. I think much more important is changing some of these mechanisms, which the white paper does start to do. It's definitely not finished, but it starts to do this, to try and redirect the incentives for some funding. And I think that's where you can see the most benefit long term, rather than sort of individual sums of money now.
Thanks, Francesca. And just over to you, Katie. I think obviously you as you expect, sort of slightly dismissive of Labour's criticisms, and I think the degree to which you went, oh, is this it? I think that was obviously something they were going to say no matter what. But I think some of the arguments there are obviously around what this government has done to local authority funding since got in 2010, and sort of the lack of funding there. That does seem like a fair criticism, and perhaps something that obviously impacts, as Francesca said, some of those kind of poor areas that the MPs you represent.
Ironically, there have actually been recent reports out in terms of local authority spending and the amount they have in their reserves. I've also previously worked for a local authority in West Yorkshire specifically, and there is also an acknowledgement in government that local authorities have in fact been able to make savings and top up their reserves, quite rightly so. So there is that aspect of it, and also the government are also looking at how the funding modelling for local authorities works, because I don't think it does work at the moment. And the NRG have also been talking to government about this. And as Francesca rightly said, your Ben Houchins, your Andy Burnhams, they can attract investment to their area. Now, whilst we've obviously mentioned R&D spending and what the government's doing there, where there is funding input initially as sort of a down payment by the government, usually you find FDI follows, because people aren't going to, take a gamble and take a risk unless it's a raw material that they can't exactly move. Similar to the mines, you need the people there with the skill sets already, because you can't move the mine and the natural resource. So if you look at South Carolina, for instance, South Carolina's economy was in, the doldrums for many years. However, what they did is they invested in education and the right skills to attract certain manufacturers there, and they also invested in infrastructure, so it was easy to do so. And another aspect of that was that they marketed their local areas in South Carolina, as well as marketing South Carolina itself. It's one thing we're actually really poor at in this country, because it just goes against the British mentality. I think, all of us have to curl our toes when we have to sell ourselves sometimes. It's a horrific set of situations. But for instance, there were financial incentives, whether they were, direct cash or, out competing other places. And South Carolina pulled, a big part of BMW out of Germany, for instance, and that's a really big competitor on the world stage in terms of economic manufacturing power. So I think that devolution does work, and that the funding isn't necessarily just from government. Yes, you have to have that initial funding. And Labour's criticism of, oh, well, there's no new money. Well, as Francesca rightly said, we never thought that there was going to be new money. We've had the budget. The government sets the budget every year. That's the way the government's always worked. I mean, if we said this for every new announcement of government, then we wouldn't get anything done. And some of this isn't about needing new money. Some of this is about reforming systems that we've already got and streamlining things. Just because you're going to reform the way something operates doesn't always necessarily mean you need new money. And this white paper didn't necessarily, obviously it set out certain projects, but not all of them. And with that, and the government announcing that, because as Andy Haldane said to us, it's not going to be a load of goodies in this white paper. That's not what white papers are intended to do. So it will be on the government going forward when they announce the start of any of these projects, and then they will be looking at the funding they already have from the Treasury. I do fear that Rishi Sunak's been a bit captured by the civil servants at the Treasury, but that's the nature of some of our chancellors, unfortunately, and he's got a very, very tough job indeed in terms of balancing the books of the UK after a great amount of public spending recently. But I think we'll see that going forward, and also seeing potentially private capital matching that. There are lots of people wanting to invest in the UK. We one of the things we brought up was about releasing the burdens on pension funds in order to invest in the UK. A lot of pension funds really want to invest in the UK, but it's a bit more difficult for them to do so. Not impossible, but a bit more difficult. And in terms of releasing that doesn't need new funding, but it will also put new funding into new areas that isn't government funding as well. So I think that's also important to acknowledge, which Labour absolutely did not, and neither did Steve Baker. So, you know, it's not just Labour from this perspective, it's also, you know, the other end too. Yeah,
I mean, obviously there are quite clearly some tensions in the Conservative Party at the moment. But we don't need to go too much about on that, I don't think. Just one for you, Sophie, here. Something else that obviously people have said wasn't necessarily mentioned a lot was around net zero. And obviously another area where people assume there needs to be a fair bit of money as well. Sophie is positive about opportunities for net zero, but there are very few mentions of net zero as a similar critical cross-government long-term plan. How does the Levelling Up white paper sit with this all?
Yeah, so it was light on net zero and sustainability more generally. I mean, I think, you know, their answer would be that it was, you know, they put the net zero paper out before Christmas, and therefore that's a thread that runs through all of this. One thing I do think, and actually it's a point back to the funding piece as well, so I'll combine the 2 points really, is that there's obviously been some funds announced both for net zero and for investment in infrastructure already, but this government is very focused on this co-creation idea that businesses have to stump up some of the cash, and whether that be UK businesses like the one I work for or international firms, that's where they're hoping that there will be investment to bring to the fore things like the net zero revolution. You know, for example, we've just signed a contract with GE to help build an onshore wind farm. It's to really support the net zero agenda, but you know, when we talk to government, which is quite often, they're very much looking to business to self-help in some of this area. So it was light on net zero, I agree, but I think we are moving now into a phase on net zero where we need to stop talking about illusory dates where we're going to be hitting the target. And in some of those instances, if we look across local government, the target's next week and we haven't got a plan to get there. So actually, what we need to do now is take people who understand this market and take those ideas into government, which is certainly something that we're trying to think about.
Great, thanks, Sophie. Just one that seems to be coming through from the questions from our audience quite a bit is around the 2030 deadline and about whether that is realistic. And obviously, I think there's a perception that is relatively close, but some of this stuff is obviously quite long term, really. I've got one here. What are we meant to understand from the 2030 deadline? Is the government acknowledging these missions are undeliverable? There's some questions in here as well about it being enshrined in law and the issues around that, and also obviously around, you know, will Boris Johnson, will this government still be about in 2030? So that deadline is clearly a little bit of an issue. Francesca, do you have something on that, please?
I think the 2030 deadline is important because it sets a clear target. What it doesn't do is say this will all be done by 2030. If you look at the wording, it's usually a sort of thing like the gap will be closing by 2030. And so I'm not so worried that it's sort of too soon, because I don't think people are trying to say that this is all going to be done and dusted in well, not even 10 years, 8 years, but we'll be in that direction. And the hope is that once you start doing this, places will start to be able to support themselves better. And that's the overall goal here. It's not about sort of handing pots of money and giveaways. That's not what these places want nor deserve. That what they deserve is a thriving economy that can then boost their own opportunities. Like there's been lots of jokes about references to Medici, but actually it's quite an important point that there's this self-reinforcing cycle whereby if you look at London, because it has the infrastructure and the talent and the investment, it means that more talented people move to London, more people invest, and it continues sort of cycling that way. So I'm not so worried about the 2030 sort of deadline, because I don't think it's a deadline at all. I think it's an idea that this is where we should be by 2030. In terms of the sort of question of it being enshrined in law, what's really important there is that they've enshrined in law to publish the spatial analysis of the progress that they're making. A really difficult thing with this is that it's not always easy to measure. We have sort of growth measures, we have income measures, but some of the less tangible things like civic pride, like community strength, are more difficult. And so they're going to start a measure of community strength to try and track some of this progress. It's something that we recommended in one of our reports, Turnaround, to try and build some of this accountability and see what progress is being made. So I think we don't need to worry too much about it being a 2030 deadline. The point is having the metrics and the data behind it to know that we're moving in the right direction, and then we can understand what works and sort of build on that further as well.
Thanks. Sophie, did you want to come in on that?
I was just going to say, it does seem quite stretching. 8 years goes in a flash. One thing that is quite interesting, we haven't talked about it much, is the piece around metrics, and I think that will hopefully hold feet to fire. And certainly I know that there's an idea that the government departments have to align with it, as do local authorities. So that will be that will be interesting to see how that looks. Certainly I know the LGA was reasonably complimentary about the white paper and ready to play its part. So what we all say in business, what gets measured gets done. So it's an important road to go on, and there's not enough of that, I don't think. And there's not enough analysis of how we're doing against those targets, which in business, if you can't demonstrate that, you're not in business for very long. So taking a more enterprise type of approach to it is one way of making those targets realistic.
Great, thanks, Sophie. Katie?
I agree that we should have metrics in which to measure by, and so I was quite pleased that that's been there. And also they're going to have essentially an arm's length board in which to look at all of this as well. I know I joked about it being led by the University of Oxford, but that was just the name that popped out there in the press releases yesterday. However, from my understanding, it's the government's intention to include business leaders as part of that, as well as politicians and all the various different other people that make the UK the great place that it is. I think from recent political history, we need to be careful about how it's enshrined in law. So the net zero was pushed through with a bit of a dubious statutory instrument, and the deadline was narrowed. And this was at a time when Parliament was distracted, although it has seemed permanently distracted since 2016. So it was sort of slipped through by the government. And I think that there needs to be proper scrutiny and a debate around the deadline as well. And also, if it's, the intention about it needs to be underway, then that's fantastic. And then how, as Sophie alluded to, how we're measuring against that year upon year is also very important. What we don't want to do is similar to, how it's felt with net zero, is kind of rushing when some of the technology isn't there. I know from some of my previous clients I've worked with who are fundamental to net zero, it was, that even they were worried as people who were potentially making money out of the situation about actually being able to deliver those targets. So I think if it's, a softer deadline, so to speak, I think that's a good idea, and that we should be making tangible progress by that stage. I think it's good in terms of 2030 is beyond this Parliament. It's not often politicians think beyond beyond the Parliament. It's one of the downsides of democracy is the best system it is in terms of how to govern. it's also got its flaws, and politicians are inherently, beings that seek to be re-elected, and often at times long-term projects don't do that, because it's very difficult to communicate that. And I think it should be welcomed that this government's actually thinking more towards the medium term and the longer term as well. So I think that's also a good thing about the 2030 target too.
Great. Thanks very much, Katie, for that. I think we'll wrap up things there, because I think we're getting close to our Arran mark. So I just thank you very much to our panelists, Francesca, Katie, and Sophie. Really grateful for you doing this at such short notice. And thank you to everyone who's watching. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. We've actually written a briefing, a policy note on the white paper, which you've all will have access to. So thanks again, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.